So my section here is going to be all about how companies are affected by ESG for the funding of their business, and that's across the capital structure. I'm going to break it into 3 sections that should be quite easily digestible. I'm going to present some evidence. I'm assuming it's a broad audience. Some people will have extremely deep knowledge, others maybe not as much, but I'm going to try and present what I think is quite compelling evidence that this is not a fad, it's real and it should be taken seriously. I'm going to talk about then the impact that this is going to have on the business practices, and then how this translates through into an impact on actually how one runs one's business operations. Okay, then I've got some recommended takeaways, so trying to distill this into just a few bullet points. And then I provide some references. The references are going to be out of the many hundreds of different research papers I've read, a couple that I think are going to be really pertinent and well worth reading. I've deliberately chosen things that I think are accessible to a good wide audience. I've also put some links in for ESG data service and model providers. And then I've done the same for climate risk. And I'll touch on why I think climate risk as part of the overall sustainability umbrella is very relevant to how ESG will evolve from a more light touch, quite highly subjective at times process to a much more programmatic and quantitative way of measuring the elements that contribute to an ESG score. Okay, so I'll go into evidence, then the business practices, and then the funding. So I'm going to touch in each section on 5 bullet points. And the first one here talks about where's the policy momentum coming from? For governments, it's ostensibly come from the origin of the Paris Agreement. It's in the private sector, it's been compounded by multiple crises. We all know the one we're in the middle of, but these are not isolated things. We've got a long track record of evidence connecting different types of impacts on our lives and how that translates into economic impact. That's been addressed through many different things: regulation, taxation, or the cap and trade scheme in the EU. And there is now immense pressure for people to disclose what their exposures are to a range of different factors. ESG just capturing the environmental, social and governance elements, but not necessarily capturing long-term climate risk or other factors that come under that wider sustainability umbrella. But you're seeing already in the UK, there's UK pensions have got a mandatory disclosure coming for climate risk. New Zealand is also committing to certain new legislation. So I've put links throughout this so that this becomes a resource that you can use after the webinar to investigate further without going down a rabbit hole. Hopefully these are quite pinpoint examples which are relevant to your business problems you're trying to solve. The second thing about policy momentum is what's happening in the academic world, and it shouldn't be underestimated how much effort and work and money is going into foundations, research programs, and the creation of new courses across all aspects of ESG and climate risk. I've given the example here of one institution I'm quite close to and familiar with, which is Imperial College. They have the Grantham Institute for Climate Change. There's one other Grantham Institute in the UK at LSE, and there's another Grantham project in the north of England. But Grantham have funded well over a dozen of these types of initiatives globally, and there are many, many more in Germany, France, the United States. I'm not so familiar with what's happening in Asia, except with Japan. One of the key things coming out of the academic institutions is the advice they're bringing to government on the transition policy that governments should be adopting. And this is referred to generically as an integrated assessment model. And I've put a link there for people who want to understand what does this mean. Effectively, it's going to be an anchor path that governments are going to embark on for their nations, and then they'll be looking at who are the main contributors to impacting this path, and that will have a profound impact on the legislation and the mandatory effects that may have on business practices. The courses, they're everywhere now. You can do an MSc in just about anything to do with ESG, ecology, climate. So it is pretty all ubiquitous. The third thing about policy momentum is standards. And as usual, there are so many competing standards which are quite typical of a marketplace in its early years of development. So despite the fact that ESG as a theme has been around a long time, the consistency in it is currently very low, characteristic of an immature market. And you'll see that standards are not just in the modeling and the measuring, but it's also in financial reporting, how you disclose, etc. So I've put links to about a dozen different standards boards. And again, you can use that to delve into what their principles and theories are about how to proceed and address this. And again, you can use that to inform the way in which you approach solving your own business problems. There is increasing coordination across these standards boards, which is reflecting the first stages of maturity in this market. And I've put a link there to where there's examples of collaboration to try and unify. So policy momentum is big, and it's not going anywhere fast. The main disturbance to this has been the US under Trump, where there's been a step backwards from relative to the other countries. In the event of a Democrat victory, it's probably going to take an enormous surge forward, the US. So in that respect, the election in a few weeks' time could have a profound impact on companies around the world within a very short period of time. So pay close attention to that would be my recommendation. Next thing on early movers, is it just the banks and asset managers, the money people, and the really obvious targets of the oil majors and the miners? I mean, initially, if you look at the distribution of who's contributing to any sort of impact, and let's narrow it down to something quite simple, say your carbon footprint. It's very easy to identify on a distribution who are making the really big contributions and who are the sustainable, really low contributions. But in between, it's massive, and it's not easy to discern between those companies. So today, the oil majors are in the crosshairs. And at the other end of the extreme, you've got the wind companies and other sustainable hydro and solar all looking quite rosy. But in between, it is an absolute mishmash. And I'll take an industry just to illustrate this. Fashion. Fashion isn't in the crosshairs. Fashion's one of the biggest consumers of water in the world. They're going to get it at some point. They've had it around working practices for manufacturing and slave labor in the past. But there's not going to be an industry, in my view, that escapes this. The obvious industries, they're good case studies. If you're not in the crosshairs, go and look at these industries and learn from them, because they're going through the early stages of the pain for this transition, and learn from the people who are doing it. The obvious industries, if I talk to the money first, the insurers were fast, and the reason for that is they're shifting liabilities. They're getting bigger, and they're becoming more frequent. So the insurers have been fast to respond to this. The banks have been fast for two reasons. One is they've got a lot of pressure from their regulators to address this. The other is they know that the collateral in the portfolios that they're lending against could become severely impaired if you get a stranded asset or a severely distressed asset, or a particular income yielding asset has to be decommissioned very early. So banks have moved quickly because of pure selfish reasons. They're not tree huggers. They are looking at this for their own viability and long-term survival. And they're not looking simply to switch off the tap, to funding their clients. They are looking for transition plans, and I'll talk about the importance of transition plans for funding integrity. The asset managers, there had been a lot of movement just around the investors, but internally in asset managers, the tide's turned. The asset managers are very actively involved, and I'll give some examples of that shortly. The obvious industries, energy, hard rock mining. It's far less obvious when you look outside those industries, but analysing the full supply chain is going to become increasingly important, and that doesn't come without its challenges, and I'll touch on that with something called scope 1, 2 and 3. The final thing about who is actually moving quickly is I've discovered one particular report I absolutely rave about, and it's from Willis Towers Watson, and they do an annual energy report, and I've been reading it forever. And this year they did one called ESG, Transforming Energy Risk Landscape. I thought it was probably one of the most accessible reports I've read, and it's actually quite chilling to read. It is utterly inescapable for certain industries not to move quickly, because the potential of being left behind versus your competitors could be truly devastating. And they outline extremely well how ESG is going to be integrated with climate risk. It's going to become much more quantitative in its measurement, and it's going to start to become a differentiating factor across all sorts of criteria. And it will lead, in their view, to wholesale change in business practices. And this final thing, I think, shouldn't be underestimated. This is not a fad. This is a major shift in business practices, and it's having quite a profound impact in firms. And a lot of firms have yet to realize how much it's going to change their practices. If I look at it from a perspective of financial services firms I work closely with, they are going to have to integrate data sets which are probably 10 times the size of data sets they have currently. And it's going to be non-financial data. It's going to be highly unstructured, and they've got to build that into everything they do, pre-transaction, mid-transaction, post-transaction, all sorts of reporting. It's going to be colossal. And interestingly, the firms who've moved their infrastructure for data to the cloud are going to find it a lot easier. And so inadvertently, the recent technology innovations are going to really help firms who've embraced cloud technology for remote data management. Next thing, the spectrum. I've talked about identifying the good and the bad, but this is all about how to measure in between. You know, the supply chain. Every firm has an upstream and a downstream to its internal. Measuring stuff outside your own firm is tough as anything. That takes us on to how to measure greenhouse gas emissions as an example. Remember, there's more than that in ESG, but I'm using something which is tangible. The scope 1, 2 and 3 I've listed there. A lot of firms are struggling to measure scope 1. Scope 2, I think there are some generic rules and approaches for that. Scope 3, extremely challenging. And I give a good example for scope 3. You take a country like Norway, which has a massive sovereign fund generated largely from oil and gas, and it's a wholly hydro independent country. But scope 3 would be where all of that is consumed, where they export it all. So they've got a nice clean country, a very sustainable energy infrastructure. But scope 3 is highly relevant to an environment where you're selling your product elsewhere. The next thing was consider the difficulty for firms. Nearly every risk management framework, operational or trading in financial firms or industrial practices, it's all about measuring, monitoring and managing. These are all costly, they're ongoing, and they can only be led from the top, because if you don't have a strategic guide from the board, everybody will be doing it piecemeal in a different way, and it won't make sense, and you'll look a mess to the outside world. Next thing on evidence. Is it just ESG or climate risk? I take you back to the Willis Towers Watson report. it is most definitely the convergence of the two. It's going to be inescapable. I've got a couple of pieces of advice around this where I would say first generation ESG has been a good start. You could easily find over 100 suppliers of ESG data and services. You'll also find massive variation. You could find your own firm classified in the top quartile by one ratings agency and the bottom quartile by another. And that's not an exaggeration. I found a coal producer in the top quartile who should be in the bottom quartile. The next generation will seek to remedy all of this. Why will it merge with climate risk? Climate risk is in its infancy too, but the techniques and approaches being used in climate risk will make ESG a lot more robust. And whilst climate risk may take longer to become embedded because of that complexity, any advances in climate risk that can accelerate ESG will be really beneficial. So I see there's a real collaboration between the two. And to that extent, I expect them to be managed under a single umbrella in firms for it to be effective. The automation's coming as well. So a combination of emerging technologies to deal with all of this unstructured data, and automation and intelligence will be really important. Again, I would really emphasize, and I'm not a technologist, I come from the practical side of running the businesses, the technical difference that having cloud technology gives the firm to deal with this type of problem is huge. If you're not a technologist, take some time understanding why cloud technology is important. It seems quite peripheral to solving the ESG problem to most people, but it's really valuable. Next thing is evidence of software and services firms. There has been an absolute explosion in the professional services space. A lot of this has been to do with generating ratings for ESG, but an awful lot has been on the advisory side of preparing companies before they make disclosures so they don't look stupid and foolish. The central thing is a TCFD disclosure, which we'll talk about a little later, but getting ready for that is absolutely key. So there's some high bullet points on here on that. It's from the board to the exco, right to the lines of business. It's going to be all pervasive in the business. It's got to be right from the ground up to the top of the board, but we need the strategy from the top down. The data services are myriad. You can buy pre-canned information on this. You can buy pre-canned ratings. Depending on the nature of the firm, some people are going right to the other extreme and actually sourcing raw data themselves in near real time. So they're treating it as a very intensive data science streaming problem. And at the other extreme, people are looking at, I'll get the ratings once every 6 months when they're published. There's a real problem in relying on stale data. If we go back to the last financial crisis, everybody lost their shirt because they relied on the credit rating agencies to tell them when the securities that they were invested in or the companies they were invested in were in a mess. So I think, again, back to emerging technology, speed is going to be really important in ESG. And just because you have an ESG capability of reporting doesn't mean it's going to be fast enough. So I've listed what's happening in the software, the SaaS, the managed services, and the intelligence systems of artificial intelligence, machine learning, etc. All of these things will make a big difference. Okay. Now, that's set the scene. I find all of that pretty compelling for me, and I think this translates directly into impact on business practices. And we're talking about funding in this section. So I want to talk what will happen with your use of funds. Traditionally, we've been pretty much a luxurious situation. You can go out, you can raise money in the capital markets or direct loans for general purposes. I think it's going to become much more prescriptive and therefore more restrictive in how people use their funds. So it isn't just about impacting raising funds, but it's how you manage those funds. I mean, typically funds get commingled in a general treasury. So you can't discern which liquidity is being allocated where, for which projects. You could have all the money for one green project temporarily supporting the liquidity on something that the investors would not be happy with. The processes around this whole treasury function have traditionally been quite poor, and that's not just in industry, it's in the banking system too. And being able to manage this, you might be able to do it at a ledger level, but I think it's going to need to be more sophisticated and evidence-based, that you're using the funds in a particular way. Ring fencing them. There's a big green bond market emerging. It's not just in the private sector, it's in government. Of the 750 billion that the EU have announced in funding, a big chunk of that is going to be green funding, possibly all of it. So far, depending on how the bonds are classified, there's about 2 trillion of green bonds out there over the last couple of years. There's an issue of greenwashing, which reputationally can really backfire on firms if they claim that they're raising funds for a green project and it's not being used appropriately. So these are all the pitfalls. The other thing is measuring returns on these funds. Segregating the money will be really important internally in funds for them to be convinced that the way they're reallocating capital is genuinely productive. So again, back to the segregation, the proper use of funds, proper measurement and allocation of funds. The next thing is the lenders and the investors. How, are there early indications of shifting trends? Insurers, most definitely. There's a big issue of look through now. Back again to not interested in general purposes, general assets. They really want to get to the detail of how you're using the money. Physical risks are huge. Incidences of physical risk in insurance, we all know, forest fires and everything, they're going up. Whether or not it's a short-term phenomenon, we don't know, but we have to assume that this is not a one-off event if you're running an insurance business. And then there's this issue of extreme losses when an asset can be totally wiped out, and then beyond that, when what you had assumed was an asset becomes a liability. Stranded assets and well beyond stranded, decommissioning things, etc. Lenders have been pretty quick. Banks have exposure to all industries. They're focused on profitability and the preservation of the creditworthiness of their portfolios. So they've moved hard and they've moved fast. I've linked in with lenders the shadow banking sector, but you could put it in with asset managers. So we're talking about private equity, venture capital, alternatives and hedge funds. They tend to be treated sometimes as a shadow banking sector, so they bridge between asset managers and lenders. The asset managers have really responded fast to investor demand. They used to have a silo of ESG products. ESG now is becoming a mainstream across the business phenomenon. It doesn't matter if the product they're offering as an asset manager is labeled ESG. They're going to be measuring ESG across all funds. There's a big shift in product demand. Flows into ESG products have been huge. And there's a recognition of the risks from the needs for the firms to have a transition to sustainable. And this is having a big impact in how asset managers become active in petitioning firms to make changes. And I've got a couple of examples on that coming up. Next thing is mandatory disclosure in business practices. We've all seen regulation in every industry. Mandatory disclosures for lenders, investors and insurers is coming through thick and fast. This mandatory disclosure is going to come with loads of pitfalls. There's loads of global variation in ESG. I've got an example here in the middle. There's no single standard. SSGA have compared 4 vendors. They find a variation as much as 50%. So there's another link for you to investigate. There are large anomalies across frameworks, methods and data. Man Group in the UK did a very good white paper on this, and I've included that link. There's a real lack of robust automated information gathering in the market. So if you're going to go out and do anything in ESG, it's very piecemeal, it's very bitty, the quality assurance can be extremely ropey. Again, it's a young market, but be very aware of that variation. There's going to be a cascade of future disclosures. TCFD is the main disclosure. There are going to be local, national level, different types of disclosure that creep through. You don't want in a firm to have to be making 50 different disclosures for different reasons. So there is a trajectory where people are trying to get to these normalized standards. But we've all had it before. You run a global operation and you've got 50 different reporting mechanisms, and it's a nightmare. And they compare 2 different reports for the US and Europe, and they don't square because the taxonomy is all different. But we've all faced that, and I would say plan carefully to cope with that. And that's why I'm bringing together ESG and climate risk under a sustainability umbrella, because the problems you encounter one, you'll encounter in the other, and you do not want to duplicate in your organization. You'll expose yourself to all sorts of criticism and enormous costs and inefficiencies. The next thing is the operating model of, do I need to change my operations? I mean, there's no doubt about it. If I look at financial services firms today, as I've said about the nature of the data, it's going to have a profound impact on them, and it's going to change the criteria at the transaction level. Everybody's trying to get as close to the source of risk as possible. And in financial services, that's when you conduct a transaction, a trade. And if you can stop it there, or you can price it appropriately there, you're really ahead of the game. You do not want to be doing it after you've taken the position. The same is going to happen in physical, real world industries. When you're negotiating contracts, when you're entering into long-term commitments, you want to be doing it at the point of inception of the contract, not as a remedial change to the terms. Global commodity firms, I think, are so important to look at who are doing this. There are some great early stage use cases. BP stands out for 2 reasons for me. One is one of the first majors in the world to suspend its dividend, and that was so critical to pension funds in the UK in particular. But firms don't suspend things like dividends lightly when they've got a 50-year history of doing it. It upends the whole business and the whole perception of a firm. They're doing this because they know they've got a capital intensive program ahead. And this is an early indicator of how seriously a firm like BP is taking its transition planning. And transition planning is central to everything, and having that very clear to the market is really key in any ESG program. We know mining is in focus through coal, but also agriculture is in focus through meat, pasture land versus forests. So these are the ones in the crosshairs today, but every industry is going to go through this pain. And when the oil and gas comes off the radar, it's going to be another industry. So just because you're not in the crosshairs today, don't assume you've avoided it. The approach to transition, I've given a 3-step recommendation. Do as much internal ESG benchmarking as possible, and do an internal TCFD. Realize what the bad news is early on, and pull out the good news, and identify how you're going to take that to an external public disclosure. A lot of people try and bury bad news. I think it's going to be incredibly difficult. The avalanche of disclosure that's coming is going to put lots of pressure on firms who are trying to resist this disclosure. So early movers, I think, could well be rewarded, both by their funding costs and all other sorts of measures. The final thing in business practices is, can I shift from public to private lenders? You know, the classic thing, oh, I'm in bad shape, can I just bury it? Private money's been great, vulture funds, distress funds. There's a lot of off the radar shadow banking money. You have to ask yourself, how sustainable is that for you? Or is it just a short-term backstop? They can become small, unreliable, and very costly programs to lock yourself into. And the moment you shift out of mainstream lending from banks and other sources, it's quite hard to get back in if you've done it because you haven't made any plans to transition. So I don't think it really solves the problem going private. There's a very important case study, I think, again, coming in the extractive industries. It's the Carmichael coal mine. Some of you will be very familiar with it, but just headlines. It's one of the biggest coal mining projects ever in the history of humankind. It was absolutely attacked viciously by BlackRock, who decided they weren't going to participate in the funding of the program. You thought it might stop there, but their activism extended to Siemens. They discovered that Siemens were providing just the signal technology, I think it was, for the railroad transportation from the mine to the port, and they're putting pressure on Siemens not to support. So the project is looking at internal funding, which will be more costly, more laborious, and more risky for them as an overall project, and stretch them. And I put a couple of other links. One is to Wikipedia and one is to the Rolling Stones magazine. I did look for balance for somebody who actually said something positive about this project. I couldn't find an article that was in support of the project with any degree of credibility. I think there was some local political support for in Australia for reasonable economic reasons, but I think in balance, I think it's very hard to defend a project like this in this climate. So that's a brilliant case study in my recommendation. Now, I want to talk about the funding specifically now. So I've got the evidence, I've seen all the a raft of implications for my operating business, and now how do I actually see the impact of this on my funding? Again, looking across the spectrum, what are people doing to position themselves for funding and to be treated well in this transition period? In financial services, in the insurance sector, one of the best disclosures I've ever seen and transparencies has been from Allianz. I've put the two links there for sustainability and their ESG programs. The reason why I think this is so instructive is they've been doing it for 15 years. And if you're looking at assessing a firm for ESG, or you're looking at doing a program for your own firm, looking at this as a blueprint is immensely valuable. It's probably the most useful I've seen. Doesn't mean it's the best. You can pick holes in it still. But if you compare Allianz with some other insurers, and I don't want to name them in case anyone's on the call, I don't want to insult anyone, but there's a few major insurers in Europe. They are years away from doing what Allianz has done. And now we look at the banks. You won't see at the moment, they're putting their TCFD disclosures out, but what you won't see from banks is how they're building ESG and climate risk factors into their internal private credit rating models. What this means is they're already starting to discriminate of who's going to get punitive rates and who's not, and who's going to hit a threshold where it is simply an exit strategy for the bank, and the client could be the last to know. So banks are moving fast, and do not be under any illusion they are building this in. It takes them a few years. Typically, to change major architecture in a bank can be, for risk, 2 to 3 years to get the initial foundations in. Again, with the technology changes that the banks are going through for infrastructure, I think they will be pushing this through at a phenomenal pace. And there are already examples of why they need to do it. Several firms in the US have taken an absolute hammering from shale. They want to be on the front foot for the most exposed companies, but they know the next wave of industries is going to come through. So they're going to move fast on this. Asset managers are probably the biggest and most vocal. And I've put another Willis Towers Watson report in there, which is well worth reading for background on the asset managers and what
Johnny, a maximum of 10 minutes.
Yep. So I've only got a couple more slides. Non-financial industries, big mixed bag, very infant stage, but they'll come through quick, as I said. What would I say on the next? A couple of bullet points on capital and transition risk. The better you're positioned with your transition risk disclosure, the better you'll be positioned for funding. Then it talks about funding lines of businesses. I've grouped this into 3 categories. Businesses you're going to have to close, businesses you're going to have to sell, and businesses that will stay core. There are some things that just aren't viable. The sooner you can get out, the better. I think BP, again, good case study on this and how it bit the bullet. It doesn't mean it's going to be a roaring success, but it's the only case study. You know, we don't have many case studies at the moment, so you got to look at what's out there. There's a few things that won't be part of your future, but still have real appealing value to other firms. You may judge that they're going to go down the pan quickly, so you get out of them quickly, and hopefully you're ahead of the pack. But don't wait. It could be a very crowded market if people start to get wind of which assets to dispose of, in which case, instead of selling them, they fall into the closure category. So again, moving fast will protect the rest of the business, because if you end up with assets which either are for closure or for selling, and it starts to tie up the rest of your business, they could threaten the viability of what is your core business in the future. Which pools of funds are shrinking and growing? I think we've outlined that. Those that are on the right trajectory for transition. Banks are becoming very discerning. They're going to favour them. Asset managers are allocating capital in the same way, and they're being very activist. The more you work closely with them, the more access you will have to their funding. Shadow banking, there will be a lot of shadow banking leaning towards those who have poor ESG for high returns, but by and large, the shadow banking system has come under a lot of pressure and regulation. They're going to face the same disclosure requirements, so it's not a lasting pool. The shrinking pools, I've summarized what those are. They're the pretty obvious ones. Anybody who's not demonstrating really good risk control and embedding climate risk and ESG into their transition plan, it's a shrinking pool. They're not going to have access, and there's some really obvious candidates that are just going to be phased out by government policy, like thermal coal. The spectrum of green and non-green, it's not useful for transition. It's binary. There's a whole series of buckets. As you end up in a funding bucket, people are going to look, are you going up in terms of transition or down from that funding bucket? And they're going to discriminate against your funding according to that. So understand where you are on that spectrum from green to non-green and the direction of travel, and that will impact your funding, in my view. The trends for rollover and funding, use of funds really matters, credit rating trends, probabilities of default. These are all changing in the banks in private, and loss given default, what the recovery would be potentially from collateral and things. Banks are also very cute on understanding what's the real collateral risk. If they think the risk on the collateral that you're pledging is poorer now because it's exposed to more climate risk, there's a potential degradation, they're going to be asking for more collateral. You may hit a ceiling collateral, in which case you'll have a shortfall on collateral, therefore you'll be able to borrow less. They may also assign higher probabilities of default and higher losses given default, in which case you're going to be squeezed on the rates and the fees. Tracking green bonds, I've put this in because we don't know yet how big it could get, but the green bond market, I've put 3 links in so you could track it. There's the Climate Bonds Initiative that has a great database on this. Germany is the first government, I believe, who's issued green bonds. And then there's this issue of, do green bonds trade at the same price? So there's an academic paper on risk premium. And then finally, equity premium. In a lot of modeling, people assume that you can either just add more equity or add more debt to solve the problem of transition. There is a limit on every company. It's not only their balance sheet ratio of debt to equity, but it's the actual quantum as well. And a lot of models out there assume that you can just borrow more. You can't. You hit a curve highly convex, you end up paying super high yield rates, and they take you into the territory where people are implying default rates. So this is a summary quickly of what's happening in dispersion risk, what happens when people fail to show a clear path of transition, and what happens when they don't disclose a proper plan. Cash flows become harder to model, discount rates become more variable, and that means that the predictability is poorer. So if you can improve the predictability both of cash flows and discount rates, you'll have much better chance of managing long-term perpetual fundraising in equity. Okay, I've done a bunch of recommendations here as takeaways, and then I've put some references on what I think are worth reading, a couple of my own articles and posts, then a couple of research article documents. There's a whole page here of ESG companies that can provide data and services, and I've done the same for climate risk models.
Thank you very much, Johnny. That's excellent. Okay, I'll now share the screen. If you can stop sharing your screen.
There you go.
Right. So,
Charles, I actually have my slides, so I can share my screen. That's fine.
Okay, you go ahead and do that then. I'll stop now.
Yeah.
Okay.
Can you see my screen, Charles?
Not yet. Okay, I think it's just coming up. There we are.
Wonderful. Okay, well, look, thank you, Charles and Minas Associates for inviting me to speak today. I have to say, Johnny's presentation was excellent, and I'm not sure how much more I'm going to be able to add, frankly. So thank you for that, Johnny. Evershed Sutherland, very briefly, we're a law firm. We have been involved in the clean energy space for over 20 years. And in fact, I saw that Caroline Emmett has joined this webinar today, and she and I were involved in one of the very first transactions in the sector almost 20 years ago. So we've historically focused on renewables, but you know,
right,
over the last...
Michelle, can you go to presentation mode? At the moment, we can see the whole of your screen. So,
okay, right.
Top.
Let me see if I can.
Slideshow. Next one. Keep going there. Then from the present slide, from the current slide. Next one, I think.
This one.
No, I think the next one to the left. Left. That's it, I think.
Lovely, thank you. Okay. Sorry about that, Charles, thanks. So historically we were involved in renewables, but of course what we do now covers the entire energy transition, and now very much ESG, and helping a whole range of clients, not just financial institutions, but also corporates, understand more about what they can do actually in terms of the transition. Every sector is very different, and Johnny alluded to that. The regulation that impacts the sector it can be different, and what is achievable within that sector is very different. We have recently with KPMG conducted a survey of over 500 of the world's largest companies, specifically on climate risk, and the outcomes across sectors are pretty diverse. So I think that it's important to bear that in mind. And this is a transition, as Johnny said, you know, we're at point A, we need to get to point B, whatever that looks like. And different sectors are going to achieve that at different rates. But as Johnny said, what is absolutely imperative is that they have a strategy and a plan, and that is being disclosed against, so that those who are engaging with them at whatever level are able to do so with full transparency of where that organisation is. So that is pretty important. Just a plug for our Global Energy Transition Club. We set this up almost a year ago. A number of you are already members, but if you would like to become a member, please let Charles know and he can connect you to me. I think one of the key things that we are noticing, particularly now, is that there is a huge amount of green capital looking for a green home. And what our report shows, which when it is issued during the Green Horizon Summit, is that there is a lack of alignment between those that are financing or funding, insuring or providing pension funds to other corporates. And there is a real concern around how within corporates, how they're actually going to fund the energy transition. So having that alignment between what capital wants to do in this space and what can be achieved by the corporates in this respect is quite important. Okay, so I don't have a huge amount of time, so I'm just going to focus on a number of what I think are important slides. Johnny alluded to this, but if you have a corporate that's sitting in the middle, where is the pressure coming from? Well, it is coming from a number of areas. Yes, it is coming from the financial institutions who are requiring the corporates to behave differently and to transition because the financial institutions themselves have reporting obligations. There is increasing regulation, which I will talk about, but also there is a huge amount of pressure from customers, whether that customer is a corporate itself or whether it's people like you and I. But as Johnny mentioned, there is a significant amount of work being done now around supply chain analysis, and in particular from a legal perspective, how you have as much control over that supply chain's decarbonisation and climate risk position and the flexibility to move if that supply chain participant is not doing what you need it to do within the required time frame. And finally, the pressure will be coming from auditors as a result of the increasing regulation. We know that there is a real issue around standardization in reporting, which I will come on to later, but also pressure is coming from credit rating agencies, again, as Johnny alluded to, and sustainability rating agencies. It will become more difficult to access capital. It will become more expensive to access capital if you are at risk of climate risk. And climate risk is not just the physical impacts of climate change, it is the financial impacts of climate change. Are you going to lose your customer base? Are you going to, is it going to become more expensive for you to access capital? Are you going to lose key business relationships because you are not decarbonising and dealing with other impacts of climate change sufficiently quickly? I don't want to be all doom and gloom though, because there is an awful lot that a climate change approach can do to improve a corporate's business and value. Ultimately, low carbon solutions can result in these various advantages: cost saving, improvement to external profile, increased customer confidence, access to a variety of green capital, the ability to encourage future growth. And the way that we see what's happening in the energy transition is we tend to categorize the participants in three blocks. There are the investors and financiers who are funding the solution providers, but they are also funding the solution off-takers. And then there are the solution providers and solution off-takers. Solution providers are not just those people who are directly contracting to provide the solution, but they are the innovators, the people who are coming up with what will eventually amount to the energy transition itself. Corporates are now in a position to procure renewable heat and power. They can procure energy efficiency solutions, utilize their own estate to generate clean energy solutions. And I know this is something that is being looked at very carefully by financial institutions as well at the moment, but it's also being looked at very carefully by governments. They're in a position to convert their transport fleet to clean fuel, in particular e-mobility. consider their approach to waste, the circular economy, raise green finance, and of course invest themselves in energy transition assets. And we're seeing that increasingly, particularly with the tech companies. They seem to be leading the way in that, and we've advised on some of the very large investments that have been made by tech companies, and some of the more innovative ones that have been made on a global basis. One recently with Apple in China, for example. In terms of procuring renewable heat and power, these are multi-billion dollar contracts. We're working on one, for example, in Saudi Arabia, which is over 2 billion. We've been working on a global basis for a number of tech companies that have been procuring multi-billion contracts for their business. So this is already happening. You know, the train has left the station. And regulation is changing as well. And what I've tried to do is simplify what's happening in the regulatory space. So in the top bubble, we have regulation, which is aimed at showing the extent to which the corporate is vulnerable to climate or environmental risk, or is resilient to the impact of climate change. That's really TCFD. Is your business a business that in 20 years will be able to operate as it has been in the locations it has been, or is it going to have to do something about that? And if it is, it needs to be doing that now. And then in the bottom left bubble, regulation aimed at showing the carbon position of the corporate itself. What impact is the corporate itself having by the emissions that it is generating? And then in the bottom right, regulation aimed at showing the impact the corporate has on the environment more generally, because a corporate could be decarbonised and it could be resilient to the physical and economic impacts of climate risk, but it could be conducting its business in a way that is not sustainable. An example might be an offshore wind developer, which in most markets they wouldn't be allowed to do this, but I'll just use it to illustrate. You know, offshore wind, most people would consider that is a low carbon solution, but if marine life locally was being impacted by that, clearly that would not be conducted in a sustainable way. That's a very easy example, but I'm sure you can think of other businesses which could meet two of those criteria but be breaching the third. And broadly speaking, that is what the regulation is divided into. And that is what Johnny was alluding to when he mentioned the fact that there is a myriad of different regulation. And I'll show you at the end of these slides just how much there is for the UK alone. And it is incredibly difficult for companies not only to navigate this, but to find a way of reporting this, which is helpful for those that are depending on the reporting to make their own decisions around engagement with a corporate. And I also saw that Leo Connell, who's a colleague of mine, has joined. He's in our consultancy business, and I'm not going to say too much about what we are developing, but we are developing a proprietary tool which will hopefully help with that. So there is regulation aimed at disclosing the carbon footprint of corporates. I'm not going to go through this. There are the SECR requirements. Why report on environmental issues? I won't spend too much time on that. Even if there wasn't any regulation, there are plenty of good reasons to report on environmental issues. There is the TCFD recommendations, which I won't go through in detail because we don't have time. Most people are familiar with these, and once implemented, as you will know, there is a continuing obligation. It is not just a front half issue. I think this is becoming very clear now. This is not about ticking the box. This is not about being able to greenwash, and this is not about lumping everything together in the front of the report. It's about ensuring that climate risk is assessed and dealt with at each point in the reporting process where it needs to be. The FRC, as you probably are aware, announced a major review on how auditors assess and report climate change. This is really what is going to lead to the change, because auditors themselves are going to have to do this in a way that delivers what the other regulations intend them to. A number of companies are already including a TCFD statement. That doesn't mean to say that those statements are going far enough. And as Johnny again mentioned, we are in a transition, and that includes a transition in the way that we deal with reporting. So I'm sure that in 2 years' time, the way those statements look will be very different. But you can see on a sector by sector basis which sectors are really taking the lead and which are behind. And interestingly, oil, gas and chemicals are on the lower end. You may also have read in the news recently that the Big Four accountancy firms have unveiled a recommended reporting framework, and this is about standardising the reporting approach, which I think any commentator who comments on this makes this point. It has to be standardised, but the challenge is standardising it on a global basis. There are various sources for practical tips on better reporting. I don't intend to go through those. In terms of UK regulation, we have mandatory rules, we have rules and regulations which are due to become mandatory, and we have voluntary rules of good practice. And I'm just going to show you a few of these in my slides, just to give you a sense of just how much there is and why the point that Johnny and I are making about reporting everything in a helpful way is very important. So I have given you a whistle-stop tour, but if you would like further information, please let me know. I do have some documents which Charles will be free to share following today's webinar. Thank you.